And again, to do a large level question, how do you see the world of finance changing in your arena, let's say 10, 20 years from now? Like looking into the future with the crystal ball, if everything goes great, what good things can we expect from blockchain?
I think it'll start to be used in certain asset classes where, like the workflow is really complicated today, right? A lot of people talk about syndicated loans or OTC derivatives. I think with all the steps in the workflow, I think blockchain can really drive a pretty meaningful improvement. Now, you do have to bet on upfront behavioral changes taking place. So a lot of the enrichment that goes on during this workflow, can be solved up front. But I think in areas like OTC derivatives and other complex asset classes, we'll start to see blockchain play more and more of a prominent role over the next 5 to 10 years. I think another area of blockchain, a lot of it, very exciting area for blockchain is the ability to bring liquidity into illiquid asset classes. And I think what's happening in private equity right now, where you're able to create private equity share tokenized on the blockchain and create the kind of marketplace around the blockchain. I think over time that will be a really powerful use case, and you can think about putting more and more types of illiquid assets on the blockchain. So I'd say in asset classes with complex workflows and in asset classes where there isn't much liquidity because of the complexity of managing the asset and the trading and the workflow around it, I think blockchain could be quite powerful.
So for example, one of our examples that we teach in class is the blockchain used to get blood diamonds out of the supply. We had a student from Sotheby's, and she was trying to figure out how would you use it in my industry. And I said, if you could verify provenance of a Van Gogh, instead of you'd be able to forget about the counterfeiting part, and you might not really need Sotheby's to do the verification if you could actually verify that the Van Gogh really is a Van Gogh. And that comes to my next question, is there going to be a huge benefit to consumers that their middleman costs, the trust people that they pay money to verify things, might be going away or being minimized?
Yeah, I think I certainly looked at Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies to kind of validate that idea that blockchain could be really beneficial to the end consumer by minimizing kind of, let's say, payment transaction costs, right? I think if Bitcoin really sort of takes off and is widely adopted, and the Bitcoin community finds ways to lower the transaction fees for Bitcoin, then I think it could get quite interesting for consumers in terms of their ability to send payments to anyone globally, right? I think Ripple is a very interesting example in terms of what they've been doing to use the Bitcoin blockchain to facilitate international payments. I think that's a great example of simplifying the number of steps it takes to move money from, let's say, my apartment in New York to my parents' home in London. Right now I can probably send a chair over to London more quickly than I can send an interbank payment, which takes a couple of days today. So the fact that you could do this in a couple of minutes using some sort of Bitcoin blockchain, I think is really exciting. And I also feel it's going to be one area to watch is going to be the emerging markets, particularly markets like India and other markets, which have the opportunity to kind of leapfrog traditional ways of exchanging payments by using cryptocurrency. So I'm potentially it's very excited to see a lot more activity there. The other interesting area as well for consumers, and this is a little bit more linked to our world, we're more of a kind of institutional fintech company, but in a lot of markets in Asia, Australia probably being the best example, the market infrastructure is a lot more centralized, right? So in Australia, the exchange has every kind of record of everyone who owns any stock, right? And because of that simpler market structure, it's going to be much easier for them to drive adoption of this new technology, which in turn could have knock-on effects to end investors and retail investors in the Australian market, right? In terms of lower transaction costs, simpler record keeping, simpler reporting, and so on.
It's funny you talk about Australia. When I was researching for my next question, how would you profit from blockchain? I looked at all the stocks that were available to invest in. There's not that many. Well, there's yours. Thank you for the 10% return the last few months. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
That's very exciting. There's IBM, which only has a little dibble in it, so nothing's happened with that. There's the NASDAQ. But a lot of the other companies that I saw, I'm challenged with buying them because they're on the Australian exchange. And there's a real estate company selling bricks where you can sell a little piece of your home, 1/10,000th of it. It's almost like getting a home equity loan when you can sell a piece of it. And they're from Australia. And I'm wondering, is Australia as a country ahead of the US in blockchain, or am I just stumbling on a random event?
I think in certain areas it may be, part of one of the challenges with the US markets in terms of rolling out blockchain is they're really, really complex, right? So when you think about, for example, the equities market, right? So I'm sure you own shares. Those shares would typically be held by a broker dealer, right? And there needs to be some reconciliation. I don't want to get too in the details here, but there's a reconciliation that goes on between, the broker dealer who owns, these shares in aggregate, the DTCC, where the broker dealer has an account, and you, the retail investor. So there's quite a lot of hopping points in the US around trading shares and around reconciling shares and so on. In Australia, it's because it's a much smaller market, that ecosystem is a lot simpler. So I think, in the US, I'd say that certainly the pace of innovation and the focus on blockchain is, really high, which is fantastic. I just think it'll take longer in some areas, probably capital markets being a good example, compared to other markets because of how complex and large the infrastructure is here in the US.
Okay. So for the students in our class, some of them are at inflection points in their career or just beginning their careers, and they're single, don't have kids, they could move on a dime. If students wanted to position themselves career-wise in blockchain, are there specific job positions or industries that you would point them in the direction of so they could maximize their income off of this?
Yeah, look, I think one thing I think it's really important if you're thinking about a career in blockchain is to get extremely hands-on with the technology. So, when I first sort of came across Bitcoin, let's say, 4 years ago, I was so intrigued about how you could create this trust in an untrusted network with untrusted actors that I sort of went really deep into looking at the code and so on to really make sure I understood the concepts around blockchain. Because I think a lot of the concepts are quite new. The phenomena around untrusted actors being able to transact is something that emerges from these three things I talked about earlier: distributed computing, cryptography, and game theory. So to really deeply understand how that emerges from those underlying disciplines, I think is really important for anyone who wants to sort of build a career in blockchain. Bitcoin's a great example because it's obviously open source, so you can get access to very detailed white papers. Ethereum's another great example. You can kind of actually download stuff and play around with the technology. I found personally that facile kind of experimentation really deepened my understanding of what the technology can do and what it can't do. So I'd probably say that's step one. And if that's a little bit too hairy, kind of getting in the weeds, then the Khan Academy I found very useful in terms of some really simple videos explaining kind of the basic concepts.
The Khan
KhanAcademy.org, yeah, really interesting place to learn about new things like blockchain. And then in terms of industries which are going to use blockchain more and more over time, obviously financial services is a natural place, right? And then you can think about retail financial services and institutional financial services. I think there's going to be a lot of investment and activity in blockchain technologies in their industry, in those industries. And then there's, applying blockchain in areas we can't even conceive of today, right? You mentioned the blood diamond, use case. So the idea that you can use a blockchain to kind of track the provenance of, high value, highly illiquid asset classes. If you have the risk tolerance to be an entrepreneur, then maybe figuring out how to apply blockchain in those areas could be, could be really interesting, right? So I think you could sort of go down a more traditional career path as a technologist or a business person with deep technology understanding in financial services. Healthcare is probably another arena where, blockchain could be used. Or you could think more entrepreneurially about it and start to apply the technology in existing markets to solve for pain points around, knowledge of who owns what and liquidity.
Yes, one of my thoughts, I coach students on social entrepreneurship, and one of my easier thoughts was helping refugees. When we had the hurricane in Puerto Rico, some of the people from Puerto Rico have moved to Florida, teachers with 15, 20 years of experience who are now teachers' aides because their paperwork that said that they're actually a teacher was lost. And I thought, if all their records have been put on the blockchain, including Syrian refugees, so many of them have PhDs, but they can't prove it. If all those records have been put on the blockchain since birth, which now we could do, that would be such a cheap way to say, I'm a human being and here are my certificates. And
Yeah.
it wouldn't be very expensive either.
Yeah, I agreed. And, I think that when I think about sort of the one, these sort of, I think you sort of asked me the question in the beginning, what's the one question, we should ask about blockchain, right? So I would say, is it as fundamental a technology as, say, the internet protocol was, right? Because at Broadridge, we spent a lot of time thinking about that specific question, because when you put it in the same bucket as something as fundamental as, let's say, TCP/IP or packet switching or the internet protocol, the way you think about it is very different versus if you put it in the bucket of, this is another distributed database type of technology, right? So we put it in the former bucket, and we may be wrong, we may be right, only time will tell. But if you believe it's that deep in terms of what it can do, then, the new ideas and new things you could do with it are really, really tremendous, and so I think that's where a lot of the exciting opportunity is. And I think, today sitting here, being very in the weeds on blockchain and being very close to a lot of use cases and a lot of what's going in the market, I will say that it'll be the stuff that'll come out in the next 10 to 20 years. Perhaps we can't even conceive of that stuff today.
And for the people who are just the standard human beings just don't like change, what would you say to the person who's saying, I'm making plenty of money now, everything's great, I don't need to learn this new stuff? Why should they learn about blockchain now? What risk do people take by not becoming aware of the technology?
So if you do believe it's a fundamental innovation, then it has the potential to affect a really broad swathe of industries, right? So particularly if you're in financial services, that's going to be an industry I think blockchain is going to have an impact on, and be try to transform it over the next 10 or 20 years. But any other industry which requires some form of tracking, some complex workflow, some, some level of auditability in the activities of that industry. And in my mind, that probably encompasses most industries, right? Blockchain is likely to have an impact at some point in the next, 10 to 20 years.
That leads me to my next question, and this is just going to be a little fun guessing game between us. In your industry, where do you think regular people, just the regular man and woman on the street, is going to see blockchain impacting their lives? Where do you think some of the first touch points are going to be in the financial sector?
I think it's probably going to be cryptocurrency. So you're already seeing that with the, with the price of Bitcoin and, Coinbase, and the amount of downloads Coinbase, I'm sure, is getting as a result of the price increase of Bitcoin, and the fact that, so many of my friends who aren't really technical and, haven't been into blockchain are starting to ask me a lot of questions about Bitcoin. So I think that's probably the first touch point.
Excellent. And I want to be mindful of your time. I could talk to you all day, but I said a half an hour, so I'm going to stick to that. My last question, what's a great question I didn't ask that people really should know about?
So I think it's that question around, how fundamental do you think blockchain is? Do you think it's like the internet protocol? Because I think if you believe it is, then the way you think about it, I think is very different versus, is it just is it just another type of database? Excellent.
Vijay, thank you so much for being generous with your time. I'm sure our students really appreciate it.
Michael, it was a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.